The Daily Life of the Aztecs on the Eve of the Spanish Conquest. Chapter 7, Civilized Life. Barbarism and Civilization. The Chichimecs and the Toltecs. How the barbarians became civilized. Self-control, good breeding, social order. The civilized man and his attitude. The precepts of the elders. The duties of the sovereign. The arts as a setting for life. Sculpture, frescoes, painting, and manuscripts. The minor arts, the arts of language, music, and dancing, the Nahuatl language, the system of writing, rhetorical and poetical styles, religious and profane poems, the role of music and dancing. Barbarism and civilization. All highly developed cultures have a tendency to set themselves apart from those which surround them. The Greeks, the Romans, and the Chinese always contrasted their civilization with the barbarism of the other nations they knew. Sometimes this was a justifiable contrast, as in the case of the Romans and the Germanic tribes, or the Chinese and the Huns, and sometimes highly questionable, as, for example, in the case of the Greeks and the Persians. Furthermore, the members of a civilized community have an inclination, when at a given moment, they look back into the past to prize some ancestors, those of the Golden Age, and to look upon others with a certain degree of pity, as having been vulgar and countrified. These two characteristics of the civilized man are both to be found in the Mexican of the classical period, or, as one may put it, between 1430 and 1520. The Central Mexicans were very much aware of the value of their culture and of its superiority to that of other Indian peoples. They did not think that they alone possessed it, but rightly considered that some other tribes, particularly those on the Gulf Coast, were their equals. On the other hand, they held that certain tribes were backward and barbarous. They knew perfectly well that their own nation, which had only recently settled into the Central Valley, had also lived a barbarian kind of life until not long ago. But they thought of themselves as the heirs of the civilized men who had colonized the plateau and built their great towns there long before them. They had no hesitation in thinking of themselves as former barbarians who derived their warlike qualities from their nomadic ancestors and the high civilization that they were so proud of from their settled ancestors. To take another parallel from our Mediterranean antiquity, it may be said that their attitude was not unlike that of the Romans in the time of the Scipios, when they were still close to their unpolished beginnings and yet were already imbued with a highly developed culture that had been involved by others before them. To these two extremes, the barbarian and the civilized man, answer two conceptions made up of combined history and myth, the Chichimeca and the Tota. The Chichimecs were nomadic hunters and warriors of the plains and mountains of the north. In the mythical past, they lived on the flesh of wild animals alone, which they ate raw, for they did not yet understand the use of fire. They dressed in the skins of beasts, and did not know how to make houses, but lived in caves which they found already made, or they made a few little houses with the branches of trees and covered them with grass. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Aztecs and other tribes that belonged to the empire, such as the Otomi of Xilotepec, came into contact with the northern barbarians in the regions of Timilpan, Tecozautla, Huichapan, and Nopalan, and traded with them, keeping them, however, at arm's length. Those who were called Teochichimeca, that is to say, complete barbarians, or Zacachichimeca, which is to say, wild men of the woods, were they who lived deep in the country, far away from the villages, in huts, caves, and the woods, and they had no fixed abode but wandered as nomads from one part to another. When night surprised them on the road, they slept in grottos if they found any. They had a lord or chief, and this chief had only one wife, in the same way that all the other Chichimeca had only one wife each. None might have two wives, and each lived on his own with his mate, seeking to find his livelihood. The same account which was dictated to Father Sahagun by his Aztec informants goes on to describe how these barbarians dressed in skins, carrying bows and arrows, clever at using plants and roots. And it was they who first discovered and used the root which is called peyote. They who eat it take it in the place of wine. In the same way they used the evil fungus called danakat, which, like wine, causes drunkenness. Their food was herbs and the fruit of the prickly pear, the root which is called simat, and others which are found by digging in the ground. Mesquite and acacia, whose fruit is edible, and the fruit of the flowers of a palm called itzcot. They knew how to get honey from the palm trees, agaves, and wild bees. They ate rabbits, hares, deer, snakes, and a great many birds. And, as they ate victuals that were neither prepared nor mixed with others, they lived healthy and strong for a long time. On rare occasions one might die, but he would be so old and his hair so white that it would be of old age that he died. The value of this picture of barbarian life is not only that it gives exact information on the habitat, the clothing, and the food of the savages, but also that it reflects the state of mind of its authors, that is to say, the settled, town-dwelling Indians. In their eyes, the barbarian was the man of nature. He was stronger and healthier than the man of the town. He possessed that manuum mira virtus pedumque, which, in the De Natura Rerum, the poet attributes to the earliest men. The Aztecs were quite aware that 4 or 5 centuries before they had lived in the same manner. At that remote period, they called themselves the barbarians of Aztlan, Chichimeca Azteca, and they had been leading that kind of primitive life for a very long time, twice 400 years and 10 times 20 years and 14 years, when their migration began. It was not by mere chance that their former dwelling place after Aztlan was called Chicomostok, the 7 caves. It may be asked what they lived upon. With their arrows they killed deer, rabbits, wild beasts, snakes, birds. They went dressed in skins, and they ate what they could find. They were therefore true collecting and hunting nomads, living as the Indians of northern Mexico continued to live until long after the Spanish conquest. The process of acculturation by which the barbarians who had penetrated the Central Valley soon came to adopt the customs, the language, the laws, and the manners of the settled civilized people is known to us through the chronicles of the House of Texcoco. This dynasty, as it happened, prized itself upon its direct descendant from Cholot, the Chichimec chieftain who led the barbarous hordes when they came to establish themselves after the fall of the Toltec Empire. Cholot and his 2 successors still lived in caves and in the woods. The 4th ruler, Guinatzin, took to urban life at Texcoco and compelled his tribe to cultivate the ground. Some of his people rebelled and fled into the mountains. The 5th, Techotlalatsin, was taught the Toltec language by a woman from Coluacan, and he welcomed civilized men at Texcoco, his capital, and incorporated them into his tribe. At last came Ixtlisochit, who adopted all the Toltec ways, that is to say, the ways of the civilized Nahuatl-speaking people whose culture had reached its peak before the coming of the nomads, and then his son Nezahualcóyotl, who appears as the most typical and most refined representative of classical Mexican culture. This whole transformation had taken no more than 200 years. For when they reached the Central Plateau, the barbarians had come into contact not only with the remains of the high Toltec civilization, but also with people who had stayed there and still practiced these civilized ways. No doubt Tula had been abandoned and the Toltec state had fallen, but the language, religion, and manners of the Toltecs persisted at Colhuacan, Cholula, Xochimilco, Chalco, and many other places. Still, other little towns such as Chaltocan were populated by Otomi, settled peasants with rustic ways, who had nevertheless lived for a long time under Toltec influence. The city-states of the newcomers were built up around those of the Toltecs, or of the nations much subject to Toltec influence. And the same applied to the city-states of the tribes who continued to come in from the northern steppes, of whom the most recent were the Aztecs. All these tribes adopted the political and social structures of their predecessors, their gods, and their arts. They took the city-state, with its council and its dynasty, dignitaries, and knightly orders, worship of agrarian deities, calendar and systems of writing, polygamy, and ball games. All that which Theodoric, Boethius, and Cassiodorus were unable to do in Italy after the fall of the Western Empire, the Mexicans achieved after the fall of Tula. And it must be admitted that in the history of human civilization, this is a most unusual success. The Aztecs and their neighbors therefore knew that they were at the junction of 2 lines of descent, the one coming from the barbarians, who in no way shamed them and whose warlike virtues they cultivated, and the other from the Toltecs, the civilized people, whose symbol was Quetzalcoatl, the inventor of the arts and of science, the protector of knowledge. As the heirs of the Toltecs, they classed themselves with those nations who had not been barbarians. The people of the rubber and the salt water, Olmeca Huixtotin, who live towards those parts where the sun is born, and who are never called Chichimecs. These were particularly the tribes who lived in the province of Chicalanco, in the south of the present state of Campeche, and who, lying between the Mexican and the Mayan worlds, were in friendly relations with the Aztec Empire without being subject to it. We have, therefore, in ancient Mexico a very clear case of cultural solidarity overlying political division, a markedly conscious unity, which took the traditional form of the Toltec myth. A myth which, it may be added, was rich in historical elements mixed with its symbolic figures. The Indian of Tenochtitlan or Texcoco, of Huaxotla or Cuautitlan, did not regard himself solely as a member of a given tribe or a citizen of a given city, but as a civilized man who shared a higher culture. By this, he contrasted himself not only with the Chichimecs who had remained in the nomadic savage state, but also with the rustic Otomi, the Popoloca, who speak a barbarous language, and the Tanime, a barbarous people, very unskillful, stupid, and rude. Implicit in this notion of superior culture was the possession of certain kinds of knowledge, the practice of certain arts, a prescribed manner of life, and a behavior that matched certain given rules. So, self-control, good breeding, social order. A civilized man is primarily one who can master himself, who does not display his feelings except when this is the accepted thing to do, and then only in the accepted manner, who preserves a proper bearing in all circumstances, and a reserved and correct demeanor. What we now call good breeding had a very great importance in the eyes of the ancient Mexicans, both as a mark of each man's quality and as a necessary factor in the social order. In the upper classes, continual attention to dignity was closely linked with taking care to appear grave, untroubled, and even humble. It was most important to keep in one's proper place. The young warriors were blamed because they spoke vainly, boasted, talked too loudly, and boorishly. Awiltlatloa, Toto Quatlatoa, Tlatla Quatlatoa, Quaquautlatlatoa, as the Codex Florentino says so prettily. No vainglorious, presumptuous, or noisy man has ever been chosen as a dignitary. No impolite, ill-bred man, vulgar in his speaking, impudent in his speech, and inclined to say whatever comes into his head, has ever sat upon the Betlao or upon the Ikbali. And if it should happen that a dignitary makes unsuitable jokes or speaks with levity, then he is called a Tecuquequectli, or a Tecuquequeshli, which means a buffoon. No important office of state has ever been entrusted to a vain man, over-free in his speaking, nor to a man that plays the fool. The upper-class ideal was an entirely Roman gravitas in private life, words, and bearing, together with a particularly high degree of politeness. It was allowed that some men, such as veterans for example, did not have to live up to this, and their extravagances of language and conduct were tolerated. But they were kept out of high office. Those who were called Quaquachiting, men who were slightly mad but very brave in war, or Otomi Atlao Zonshinting, slightly mad Otomi with a shaved head, were great killers, but they were unadapted for the tasks of government. A true gentleman should show himself to be humble and not overweening, very wise and prudent, peaceable and calm. And that, said a father to his son, must be the truth in your heart, before our God, Tezcatlipoca. Let not your humility be feigned, or otherwise you will be called a Titoloshon, hypocrite, or Titlan Nishikipile, feigner. For our Lord God sees what is in the heart, and he knows all secret things. This humility, which might perhaps be more truthfully described as pride restrained by self-control, showed itself by moderation in pleasure. Do not throw yourself upon women like a dog upon its food. By a measured way of speaking, one must be calmly, not too fast, not too heatedly, nor loud. Keep to a moderate pitch. neither high nor low, and let your words be mild and serene, by discretion. If you hear and see something, particularly something wrong, pretend not to have done so, and be quiet, by willing readiness in obeying. Do not wait to be called twice. Answer at once the first time, by good taste and restraint in dress. Do not be too curious in your clothes, nor freakish. On the other hand, do not wear poor torn garments. And finally, by a man's whole bearing. In the street, walk quietly, neither too fast nor too slow. Those who do not observe this rule are called ishtotomak kwekwets, people who go looking in every direction like idiots, without nobility or gravity. Do not walk with your head down or leaning on one side or looking to right and to left, or else it will be said that you are an ill-bred, undisciplined fool. At meals, do not eat too quickly or in a careless manner. Do not take great mouthfuls of maize cake, nor stuff your mouth, nor swallow like a dog, nor tear the cakes to pieces, nor hurl yourself upon what is in the plate. Eat calmly, or you will be mocked. Before the meal, wash your hands and mouth, and do the same after you've eaten. These precepts of the elders Huehuetlatoli made up a distinct section of literature with its own manner and style. They show what the Aztecs thought of as conduct suitable in a well-bred man of their day. The Huehuetlatoli, preserved in its Nahuatl form by Father Olmos, recites at length and in great detail all the ways in which a young Mexican of the better sort was expected to conduct himself, how he was to behave to his superiors, his equals, and his inferiors, how he was to revere his elders, show compassion for the unfortunate, refrain from light words, and in all circumstances be most scrupulously polite. These, for example, are the directions that must be followed if one were invited to have a meal at a great man's house. Take care how you go into the Lord's house, for without your noticing it, you will be watched. Come respectfully, bow and make a greeting. Do not make faces when you eat. Do not eat noisily and without care, like a glutton. Do not swallow too quickly, but little by little. If you drink water, do not make a noise, sucking it in. You are not a little dog. Do not use all your fingers when you eat, but only the 3 fingers of your right hand. Do not cough and do not spit, and take care not to dirty the clothes of any of the other guests. This courtesy, which was formerly so firmly inculcated that even now the Indians are exquisitely polite, was not only shown in gestures, attitudes, and the meaning of the words, but even in the form of language. Nawa, a subtle language, rich in resources, had respectful particles and even respectful conjugations. The suffix "sin" was added to the names of persons one wished to honor, to their titles, and to any word at all to which one wished to give a shade of respect or tenderness. Motecusomatzin, the revered Motekusoma, Totatzin, our honored father, Itzpopoyotzin, a blind person worthy of compassion. When an honored or beloved person was addressed, the verbs were conjugated with special suffixes. Tiola means thou seest, but Timoyolotia may be translated as your lordship sees. Timomati means thou thinkest, but Timomatia, thou art so kind as to think. Thou condescendest to think. Miki is to die. Mikulia, to die honorably. While it is generally thought suitable to retain a dignified, simple attitude, there were circumstances when, on the contrary, etiquette insisted upon a display of emotion. The bride who was about to leave her parents' home answered the speeches of the representatives of her husband's family with tears. Young traders beginning their career listened respectfully to the homilies of the old Posteca, and when they replied, they wept copiously by way of showing their gratitude and humility. May not this cult of moderation in deeds and words, this dislike of excess and what the Greeks term hubris, and the extreme importance of good breeding and civility be explained as a reaction against brutishness of manners and violence of passions? For this delicate flower of chivalry bloomed in a world which had, in the 16th century, barely emerged from a long period of wars, coup d'etat, plots interspersed with assassinations and treason. The generation for which the precepts of the elders were meant was too young to have known these troubled times, but the vicissitudes, the insecurity, and the bloody outbreaks which were characteristic of the days of Azcapotzalco's, hedge ceremony and the beginning of the Triple Alliance were not forgotten. The great men of those times seem to have been in a grip of savage, uncontrollable passions, shocking rages, and lusts whose violence did not stop short of crime. The first Motekusoma, whose name he who grows angry like a lord is revealing, had his own brother killed, the Tlacatecatl, Wewe Zacatzin, in an access of rage over some trivial thing. The tyrant Tesosomok and his son Mashlaton sent their assassins to murder anyone who offended them, including Chimalpopolka, the unfortunate king of Tenochtitlan and the king of Texcoco. And even the wise king Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco himself committed a crime that was to shame his descendants, when, distracted by his love for the young Azcaxochitzin, he had her fiancée treacherously killed on the battlefield. These 15th century Mexicans, as we see them reflected in their chronicles, were passionate, scheming, and unscrupulous. They would stop at nothing to satisfy their desires or their lust for power. The survivors of this troubled time seem to have grown better behaved in their old age. The philosophic poems of the king Nezahualcóyotl, the expression of a serene and disillusioned mind, and of an Epicureanism whose wisdom was founded upon a knowledge of the vanity of the passing show, are perfectly characteristic of the period of reaction that follows one of upheaval and disruption. This attitude triumphed at the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th, and the ideal of the civilized man succeeded that of the adventurer ready for anything. And these violent beings were repressed, and a barrier was set up against the free play of instinct. After the cruelest trials, Mexico had succeeded in creating a pattern, and in this pattern, under the reign of the second Motekusoma, courtesy was an essential part. As the dynasties, and particularly that of Tenochtitlan, grew stronger and chaos receded, this pattern or order took the form of monarchy and came to depend primarily on the person of the sovereign. However wide his powers, modified by those of the Supreme Council, they were never so great as his obligations. The king of the allied cities, the lords of the self-ruling towns, and of course, above all, the Emperor of Mexico, were heavily burdened with these duties. They were not only responsible for the conduct of the civil and military administration, but also for the welfare and even the life of the nation, for the abundance of fruits of the earth. They first had to ensure this by serving the gods devoutly. Then they had to take all the necessary measures, such as preventing disasters or diminishing their effects, building up reserves, giving out victuals and clothing, and showing their goodwill to the common people. If they did not do these things, the people would murmur against them, and the emperor would feel his throne tremble. The official doctrine, which was expressed at length in speeches at the time of the emperor's election, was that the ruler was chosen by the gods, that the burden of his office was terribly heavy, and that his primary function, after the service of the gods, was the defense of the people. "Lord," they said to him, "it is you who will now carry the weight and the burden of this state. The burden of government will be on your back. It is upon your shoulders, in your lap, and between your arms that our God has set the task of governing the people, and they are fickle and prompt to anger. It is you, Lord, who for certain years are going to sustain this nation and care for it as if it were a child in a cradle. Consider, Lord, that from now on you are to walk upon a very high place along a narrow path that has great precipices to the right and the left. Be mild in the use of your power. Show neither teeth nor claws. Please the people and make them happy with games and decent amusements, for in doing this you will be famous and beloved. Your people are protected by your shade, for you are like the pochot or the ahuehuet, which gives a great round shadow, and the multitudes are protected by your branches." All the contemporary documents strongly emphasize this aspect of the ruler as protector. The pattern depends upon him, and in order that this pattern may be good, humane, and in conformity with the needs of the people, the emperor must control his passions. They left him in no doubt upon this point on the day of his election. Say nothing, do nothing with too much haste. Listen to those who complain to you or bring news calmly to the end. Do not be partial. Do not punish anybody without reason. Upon the demands and the ikpali of lords and judges, there should be neither passion nor haste in words or deeds. Nothing should be done in the haste of anger. Never speak angrily to a man, nor terrify anyone with your ferocity. Lord, you must also take care never to speak lightly, for that would make your person despised. You must now make your heart the heart of an old man, grave and severe. Do not give yourself up to women. Do not suppose, Lord, that the man and the Ikbali of kings is a place of pleasure and delight, for on the contrary it is one of great labor, sorrow, and penance. It was the sovereign who was to be the first to obey this law of moderation and subdue his passions, for everything depended upon him. The enlightened despot was the ideal of the time, the philosopher emperor able to command himself in order to govern for the good of all. The more or less historical or legendary anecdotes related in the chronicles are significant. They often concern Nasahuwa Koyot, who had given up the adventures and the violent ways of his youth towards the end of his reign, appears as a kind of Harun al-Rashid. There are stories of him disguised as a simple hunter, listening to the grievances and complaints of the common peasants, and then sending for them to the palace to give them splendid gifts. Or again, he is shown overhearing from a balcony the words of a woodman who, sweating under his load, cried, The man who lives in this palace has everything he needs, while as for us, we are worn out and we die of hunger. The king had the woodman brought in, and having first advised to take care of what he said, because walls have ears, he bade him think of the weight and the burden of business that he had to bear so as to protect, defend, and justly maintain so great a realm. And at last he sent him away loaded with presents. This king was so full of compassion for the poor that he commonly went up in a mirador which overlooked the marketplace, who watched the poor people who sold salt, wood, and vegetables, scarcely enough to make a living. And if he saw that these poor people did not sell their wares, he would not sit down to his meal until his maitre domos had gone to buy all these things themselves to make presents of them to others. He was particularly careful to give food and clothing to the old, to the sick, to those wounded in war, to widows, and to orphans. And in this way, he spent a great part of the tribute he received. In the same spirit, it was related of Motekusuma II, that hunting in the gardens outside the city, he made the mistake of plucking an ear of maize that had already formed, without asking the peasants' leave. Lord, you who are so powerful, said the peasants, how can you steal an ear from me? Does not your own law condemn a man to death for stealing an ear of maize or its value? That is true, replied Motekusoma. Well then, said the gardener, why have you broken your own law? The emperor then offered to give him back his ear, but the peasant refused. Motekusoma gave him his own cloak, the imperial Shuhayat, and said to his dignitaries, This poor man has shown more courage than anybody here, for he has dared to reproach me to my face without having broken my own laws. And he raised the peasant to the rank of Tekutli, entrusting him with the government of Xochimilco. What is interesting about these improving little tales is not that they do or do not describe real facts, but that they show the feelings of the time. This was what a good sovereign ought to be, one who would listen to complaints and remonstrances, merciful master of himself. He was the culminating point of the community and the state, and he was to incarnate all those virtues which his time thought the most valuable and which the people expected to maintain the rightful order in the common interest. The arts as a setting for life. The arts provided the setting of civilized life, which was preeminently that of the upper classes, with a quality and a refinement which called to mind the golden age of the Toltecs. Mexican culture had no notion of art for art's sake, and sculpture, painting, jewelry, mosaic, featherwork, and the art of the miniaturist all combined to express the beliefs of the time in its deepest tendencies, to mark the degrees of rank, and to surround everyday activities with forms that had always been appreciated. Architecture has already been treated in Chapter 1, and we will not speak of it again in this place. But the great buildings were filled with statues and covered with bas-reliefs, a very great proportion of which were based upon religion. Profane sculpture was not wanting, however. It existed, and sometimes one finds the vigorously carved head of a man of the people, sometimes the familiar plants and animals of the country, sometimes, formalized and heretic, the great deeds of the emperors or historic scenes, such as the conquest of Tizoc, or the dedication of the great temple by his successor. The emperors like to leave their stone or golden likenesses behind them, and one of the very few gold figurines that escaped the Spanish melting pot represents Tizoc. 14 sculptors carved the statue of Moctezuma II at Chapultepec, and they were rewarded with immense quantities of cloth, cocoa, and victuals, as well as receiving 2 slaves each. Some monuments were decorated with frescoes. In central Mexico, the tradition of fresco painting goes back as far as the civilization of Teotihuacan, and it was particularly full of life in the region between Mexico and the Mixtec Mountains. Aztec mural painting vanished with the buildings of Tenochtitlan. But in places far from the center, such as Malinalco, traces of it are still to be seen. But although the frescoes that adorn the walls of the temples and the palaces were destroyed when the walls themselves collapsed before the attack of guns or pickaxes, Mexican painting has survived in the form of the pictographic manuscripts, some of which have come down to us. It is an art somewhere between writing and miniature painting, with its delicate, scrupulously worked glyphs and its representation of historic or mythical scenes. The Tlaquilo, or the Tlaquiloani, the painter-scribe, was very much respected whether he worked for the temples, the law, or the administration. The ancient Mexicans loved their books, and when the fanatical hands of Zumarraga hurled thousands upon thousands of precious manuscripts into the fire, the flames destroyed a very great part of their culture. It was above all the minor arts that made life more decorative, for they were applied with great success to everything from the humblest earthenware dish to jewels of gold. Nothing was vulgar, nothing showed the signs of hasty workmanship or the naked pursuit of effect and profit. The conquerors were astonished by the extraordinary and luxurious productions of the craftsmen of Tenochtitlan, the goldsmiths, lapidaries, and featherworkers. These Tolteca, for as we have seen they were called by this honorable title, by way of showing that they were in the direct tradition of the Golden Age, knew how to smelt and model gold and silver, carve the hardest stones, make the scrupulously formed mosaics of dazzling feathers which decorated the shields, the flags and the cloaks of the chiefs and the gods. The means at their disposal for the creation of all these delicate wonders were a few tools made of stone, copper, and wood, moistened sand for wearing down jade or crystal, and above all, an infinite patience and astonishing sureness of taste. The goldsmiths used the Sire Perdue method for making statuettes of Indians of foreign tribes, animals, tortoises, birds, fish, crustaceans, lizards, and necklaces decorated with little bells and metal flowers. These are examples mentioned by Aztec informants. They were acquainted with the enhancing of the color of gold by an alum bath, and they hammered and chiseled it into sheets and leaves. The lapidaries worked rock crystal, amethyst, jade, turquoise, obsidian, mother of pearl, etc., with instruments made of reed and sand and emery. They also set out little pieces of stone and beautiful mosaics upon a background of bone, stucco, or wood. The Amanteca and the featherworkers either fixed their precious tropical feathers on light reed frameworks by tying each one with cotton, or stuck them onto a cloth or paper so as to form mosaics in which certain effects of color were obtained by transparency. This was a typically and exclusively Mexican art, which lingered in the form of little feather pictures after the conquest, and then disappeared entirely. Almost nothing has survived of these fragile masterpieces. The imperial official who entered into contact with the Spaniards after their landing in the region of Veracruz took several excellently worked, very rich golden objects out of a chest and caused to be brought 10 loads of white cloth made of cotton and feathers, things very well worth seeing. According to native sources, Moctezuma sent Cortez the following presents. First, a costume of Quetzalcoatl, which included a turquoise mask, a plume of quetzal feathers, a great jade disc with a gold round in the middle of it, a shield made of gold and mother of pearl, decorated with quetzal blooms, a mirror encrusted with turquoises, a bracelet of gems and golden bells, a turquoise headdress and sandals ornamented with obsidian. The second present was a costume of Tezcatlipoca, which particularly included a feather crown, a gold breastplate, and a looking glass. Then there was a costume of Tlaloc, with a crown of green plumes and jade earrings, a jade disc and a golden disc, a turquoise scepter, and golden bracelets and anklets. The list goes on with a mitre of jaguar skin adorned with plumes and gems, turquoise and gold earrings, a jade and gold breastplate, a shield made of gold and quetzal blooms, a golden mitre with parrot feathers, and a mitre made of thin sheets of gold. Among the treasures that Cortez received from Moctezuma II and which he sent to Charles V in July of 1519, one finds, among other things, 2 wheels, 10 spans, 6 feet 10 inches wide. The one made of gold to represent the sun, and the other of silver for the moon. A golden necklace of 8 sections with 183 small emeralds and 232 garnets set in it, and 27 little golden bells hanging from it. A wooden helmet covered over with gold. A gold scepter studded with pearls. 24 shields made of gold, feathers, and mother of pearl. 5 fishes, 2 swans, and other birds of cast and molded gold. 2 large gold shells, and 1 gold crocodile with filigree decorations. Several headdresses, mitres, plumes, fans, and fly whisks, all made of gold and feathers. As the Aztec Empire grew, so the life of the Mexicans became more and more luxurious and sumptuous. For their boundaries reached the tropical countries that produced the feathers, the Mixtec Mountains, where the gold was found as gold dust in these streams, and those parts of the Gulf Coast where the best jade came from. The statues of the gods were clothed with feather cloaks, and the dignitaries, abandoning the austerity of former times, adorned themselves with brilliant plumes, chiseled gems, and jewels of gold. As we have seen, men of the highest class loved learning the lapidary's art and themselves carved jade or turquoise. Gold and silver arouse less desire and admiration than plumes and gems, the plumes and gems that perpetually recur in the language of verse and rhetoric. Lords and poets, traders and craftsmen, they were all fascinated by the gilded green of the quetzal plumes, the turquoise blue-green of the feathers of the xiutotot, the splendid yellow of parrot feathers, the translucent green of the great pieces of jade brought from Xicalanco, the red of garnets and the dark lucidity of obsidian, and the polychromatic brilliance of all these things surrounded men's lives with an aura of splendor and beauty. Language, music, and dancing. The Mexicans were proud of their language Nahuatl, which, by the beginning of the 16th century, had become the common tongue, the Koine, of the whole vast country. The Mexican language is considered the mother tongue, and that of Texcoco is thought the noblest and the purest. All the languages other than this were held to be coarse and vulgar. The Mexican language spreads over the whole of New Spain, and the others are thought barbarous and strange. It is the richest and fullest language that is to be found. It is not only dignified, but also soft and pleasing, lordly, and a high of nobility, succinct, easy, and flexible. In fact, Nahuatl has all the qualities that are necessary in the language of a civilization. It is easy to pronounce. It is harmonious and distinct. Its vocabulary is very rich, and the structure of the language allows the creation of all necessary words, and most particularly of abstract terms. It is excellently adapted for the expression of all shades of thought and all the aspects of the physical world. It is as well adapted to the lapidary concision of annals as to the flowery rhetoric of speeches or to poetic metaphor. As the basis or raw material of a literature, it could hardly be surpassed. At the time of which we are speaking, the Aztec system of writing was a compromise between ideogram, phoneticism, and simple representation or pictography. The symbol for defeat, a blazing temple. The glyph for war, Atlachinoli, night, shown by a black sky and a closed eye. And the chronological signs are ideograms. The syllables are groups of syllables tlan, teeth, tlatli, de, a stone, det, guau, a tree, guauit, a, some, water, atl, cinco, the lower part of a human body, zintli, acoli, the elbow, ban, a flag, bantli, ish, an eye, ishtolotli, deo, a sun, translated as God, deot, goyo, a brown hole, goyoktik, denan, a wall, denamit, teku, a diadem and hence a lord, tekutli, ikba, a ball of thread, ikbat, mi, an arrow, meat, yaka, a nose, yakat, and many others all provide examples of phoneticism. The conventional images, often highly formalized, which represent the objects that have been listed, are used to write these sounds, even if there is no reference whatever to the objects themselves. Thus, the name of the village of Otlatitlan is shown by a reed, Otlat, an ideogram, and by teeth, Tlan, a phonogram. In practice, the two systems were combined and color was also used. The word Tecosautla was represented by a stone tet upon a yellow background, Kosawik. The word Tlatlauquitepec by a formalized mountain Tepet, painted red, Tlatlauqui. And mythical or historical scenes were simply represented by the characters together with the glyphs corresponding to their names and, where it was called for, by the signs dating the event. In its state at that time, this writing did not permit the exact notation of spoken language. It was adapted for summarizing events, and by a mixture of phonograms, symbols, and representations, it provided a basis for memory. Historical accounts, hymns, and poems had to be learned by heart, and the books acted as prompters to the memory. This was one of the principal aspects of the education that the priests of the Calmecac gave their young men. They carefully learnt the songs that were called the Songs of the Gods written in the books, and they carefully learned the account of days, the Book of Dreams, and the Book of the Years. Fortunately, in the period that followed the conquest, thanks to enlightenment like Sahagun, a certain number of Indians learned to write in Latin characters, and they used this tool, infinitely better than anything they had up to that time, to transcribe those native books that had not been destroyed or to set down what they had learned by heart. In a way, something, though no doubt a very small part, of the ancient Mexican literature was saved. This literature was so varied and so wide that no other people who had reached the same degree of social development possessed anything that approached it. It covered all aspects of life, for its aim was to help the memory to retain the whole accumulated knowledge of the foregoing generations, their religious ideas, myths, ritual, divination, medicine, history, law, and in addition to all this, it included a great deal of rhetoric and lyric and epic poetry. It was divided into prose and verse. Prose for instructive treatises, mythical and historical narratives. Verse, usually trochaic, for religious or profane poems. Many accounts or descriptions, which with us would have been in prose, were learnt in Mexico in the form of poetry or rhythmic verses, as being easier to memorize. Rhetorical and poetic style made the utmost use of the language's possibilities. The richness of Nahuatl allowed the piling up of near synonyms, separated from one another by faint shades of meaning, for the description of one deed, and although this may give a certain tautological air in translation, in the original it can be exquisite. In order to say that the sorcerer Tilacahuan took on the appearance of an old man, the literal expression of the Aztec narrator is, he transformed himself into a little old man. He changed himself. He disguised himself. He became very much bowed. His head became quite white, his hair quite white. Another very common stylistic usage is that of expressing an idea by the juxtaposition of two words, phoning a binominal term, such as Mishtitlan Ayautitlan, in the clouds in the mist, meaning mysteriously, Noma Nokchi, my hand, my foot, my body, in Chalchiwit, in Quetzali, jade feathers, richness or beauty, Itlato Ihio, his word, his breath, his speech, in Chochit, in Cuicat, flower, song, a poem, etc. The same tendency is to be seen that in that parallelism continually sought after in poems and treatises, which consists of setting two phrases with the same signification side by side. Choquitli Moteca, Ishayot, Pichawi, sorrow overflows, tears fall. Phonetic parallels were also esteemed, as well as assonances and alliterations. All these figures, together with often exceedingly elaborate metaphors, were the mark of fine language, the speech of the well-bred, civilized man. Just as to the style of the annals was generally dry, succinct, and reduced to the barest relation of the facts, so that of speeches was flowery and even to our taste turgid and bombastic. Some examples have already been given, but it is impossible to overemphasize the extraordinary appetite of the Mexicans for this philosophical moral rhetoric. They can make untiring speeches upon any subject whatsoever, and endlessly answer one another with commonplaces, in the Latin rhetoric sense of generally accepted ideas upon which they would throw the cloaks of their metaphors by way of exercise. They were much addicted to the art of oratory. During their harangues they sat upon their heels without touching the ground. They did not look up or raise their eyes. They did not spit or make gestures, and they did not look you in the face. When a speaker had finished, he rose and withdrew with his face lowered, without turning his back, very modestly. On all occasions, or those of private life, there would be positive tournaments of eloquence, whether the matter in question was the election of an emperor, the birth of a baby, the departure of a merchant caravan, or a marriage. Poetry was no less esteemed. The dignitaries and their families, and this included some most distinguished women, provided themselves upon poetic excellence. At Texcoco, where everything to do with the fine language was particularly honored, one of the 4 great councils of government was called the Council of Music and the Sciences. As well as the execution of laws relating to worship and witchcraft, its functions included the encouragement of poetry. It organized competitions, and at the end of them the king presented valuable gifts to the prize winners. There were scholarly noblemen who were occasional poets, the most illustrious of them being the king Nasahuacoyot himself, and there were also professional poets in the service of great men. These celebrated the deeds of heroes, the grandeur of royal houses, and also the delight and sadness of life. These poets taught singing and music in the houses of song, Guicacali, that were attached to the palaces or maintained by the districts. The very name of the poet, Guicani, the singer, shows that poem and song were synonymous, for the poem was always sung at the very least declaimed to the accompaniment of musical instruments. The text of some poems is preceded by a notation that shows the rhythm of the teponazli, whose beat was to sustain the recital. Certain poems showed that the poet was conscious of his high mission. I chiseled the jade, I poured gold in the crucible. Here is my song, I inlaid the emeralds. Here is my song. He also said, I, the poet, the master of song, I, the singer, I beat on my drum. Let the beating awaken the souls of my companions who are dead. And I, the singer, I make a poem that shines like an emerald, a brilliant, precious, and splendid emerald. I suit myself to the inflections of the tuneful voice of the Tzinitskan. Like the ring of little bells, little golden bells, I sing my song, a scented song like a shining jewel, a shining turquoise and a blazing emerald, my flowering hymn to the spring. The Aztecs themselves divided poetry into a certain number of kinds, of which the first included the Teocuicat, holy song or hymns, and fortunately, by means of Sahagun's informants, we have the transcript of some of these, a veritable treasure for the study of the language of the ancient Mexicans and their religious thought. In reading them, it must be remembered that these poems were not only sung, but acted. That is to say, each of the verses, no doubt, repeated a great many times, accompanied a given phase of the ritual, some said action of the priests, or some specific mass dance. These religious songs, handed down from a remote period by tradition, were often very obscure or even totally incomprehensible to the Aztecs themselves, or at least those who were not priests. They are loaded with esoteric allusions and metaphors. The flower of my heart has opened. Here is the Lord of Midnight. She has come, our mother, she has come. She, the goddess Tlazoteotl, the god of maize is born, in the paradise of Tamoanchan, in the place where the flowers raise their heads, he who is called One Flower. The god of maize is born, in the garden of rain and mist, there where the children of men are made, there where they fish for jade fishes. Here is the day, dawn is coming up, catch-all birds are flying about from place to place and feeding, there where the flowers stand upright. In honor of Tenochtitlan's national god, they sang, I am Huitzilopochtli, the young warrior. There is none like me. I have not put on my parrot feather cloak in vain, for thanks to me the sun is risen. And for the goddess Teo Inan, the mother of the gods, the yellow flower has opened. She, our mother with the skin mask. She has come from Tamuanchan. The yellow flower has bloomed. She, our mother with the skin mask, she has come from Tamuanchan. The white flower has opened. She, our mother with the skin mask, she has come from Tamuanchan. The white flower has bloomed. She, our mother with the skin mask, she has come from Tamuanchan. Ah, she has become a goddess. Among the cactus, our mother, the obsidian butterfly. Ah, you have beheld the 9 steps. She feeds on the hearts of stags, our mother, the goddess of the earth. And here is another terrestrial goddess, Siwakawat, in her agrarian and her warlike aspects. The eagle, Guilatzli. Her face is painted with snakes' blood, and eagle's feathers are her crown. It is she who is protecting the cypress of the country of Chalman and Coluacan. The maize is in the sacred field. The goddess leans on her stick with bells. The agave thorn is in my hand. The agave thorn is in my hand. In the sacred field, the goddess is leaning on her stick with bells. The bundle of weeds is in my hand. In the sacred field, the goddess leans on her stick with bells. 13 eagle, that is how they name her. Our mother, the goddess of Chalman. Give me the cactus arrow, the sacred emblem. Here is my son, Mishkwat. Our mother, the warrior, the roe deer of Coluacan. She is adorned with plumes. Here is the dawn. The order of battle is given. Here is the dawn. The order of battle is given. May we bring back some prisoners. The earth shall be ravaged. She, the roe of Coluacan. She is adorned with plumes. Other and much more simple hymns are in fact little more than indefinitely repeated magical formulae. An example is of the song Chicomequot, the goddess of maize. In singing this, they endeavored to stir nature into its annual rebirth. O revered goddess of the 7 years, rise, awake. O our mother, you are leaving us today. You are going to your own country, Tlalolcan. Rise, awake. O our mother, you are leaving us today. You are going to your own country, Tlalolcan. The Mexicans class poems, other than hymns, in several categories according to their subject, origin, or nature. Yauquicat, war song. Chalcayot, poem after the fashion of Chalco. Xochiquicat, Quequetli, flowery, bantering song. Chopin Quicat, poem to spring, etc. Some of these poems, for example, the song of Quetzalcoatl, were real sagas, and other reflections upon the brevity of life or the uncertainty of fate. In the combinations of recital, song and dance and music, there were also found to be elements of a dramatic art. In these performances, there were actors dressed to represent historical or mythical heroes. They used dialogue, and at times there were exchanges between the characters in a choir. These performances, which were at once ballets and tragedies, would present the king Nasahuapili, for example, or his father Nasahuacoyot, or the emperor Motecuzoma. Mime songs, some of them sung by women, were inserted into these compositions. For instance, My tongue of coral, of emerald my beak. I think much of myself, O my parents. I Quetzalchitzin. I open my wings, I weep before them. How shall we ever rise into the sky? The actress who sang this was probably dressed as a bird. Flowers and death, like twin obsessions, adorn all Mexican lyric poetry with their brilliance and their shadows. Oh, if only one lived forever. Oh, if only one never died. We live with our soul torn apart. Lightning flashes about us. We are spied upon and attacked. We live with our soul torn apart. We have to suffer. Oh, if only one lived forever. Oh, if only one never died. And again, shall my heart go as flowers that wither? Some day shall my name be nothing? My fame nothing anywhere upon the earth? At least let us have flowers. At least let us have some singing. How shall my heart manage to survive? We go about on the earth in vain. This poem from Chalco shows the same preoccupation. Vainly you seize your flower deponatzli. You throw handfuls of flowers, but in vain. They wither. We too, we are here singing our new song. And there are new flowers too, in our hands. May our friends delight in the flowers. May the sadness fade out of our hearts. Let no one be overwhelmed by sadness. Let no one's thoughts wander about over the earth. Here are our precious flowers and songs. May our friends delight in them. May the sadness fade out of our hearts. Oh, friends, this earth is only lent to us. We shall have to leave our fine poems. We shall have to leave our beautiful flowers. That is why I am sad as I sing for the sun. We shall have to leave our fine poems. We shall have to leave our beautiful flowers. And from here on we passed on to the expression of that Epicurean philosophy which seemed to have been so general among the more educated people. Oh, you do not come twice onto the earth, Chichimek lords. Let us be happy. Does one take flowers along to the land of the dead? They are only lent to us. The truth is that we go. We leave flowers and singing and the earth. The truth is that we go. If it is only here on the earth that there are flowers and singing, let them be our wealth. Let them be our adornment. Let us be happy with them. The magnificent landscape of the country is also to be seen in Mexican poetry. One of the ambassadors sent by Huachotzingo to ask help from Motecuzoma sees, from the mountains, the whole valley of the Mexico spread out. I climb, I reach the height, the huge blue-green lake, now quiet, now angry, foams and sings among the rocks, flowery water, greenstone water, where the splendid swan, with its rippling feathers, calling swims to and fro. And when the sun sets, our father, the sun, dressed in rich feathers, thrusts himself down into a vase of gems, decked with a turquoise necklace, among many colored flowers which fall in a perpetual rain. Short extracts like these can scarcely give an idea of the wealth of this literature, for it is rich, although only fragments have come down to us. The ancient Mexicans' passionate love of oratory and poetry, music and dancing, had free rein at the feasts, the banquets, and the innumerable ceremonies at which one might see the young men, splendidly adorned, dancing with the courtesans in all their glory, and the dignitaries and the emperor himself taking part in the traditional balls. Dancing was not only an amusement, it was not even only a rite. It was a way of deserving the favor of the gods by serving them and calling upon them with one's whole body. Aztec music, of which nothing is left to us because it was not written, was not rich in resources. It had but a few wind instruments, the conch, the trumpet, the flute, the whistle, and, most important, some percussion, the upright drum wewet, and the two-tone wooden gong, teponaztli. The music primarily gave rhythm for singing and dancing, and in the cool nights of the high plateau, by the light of resinous torches, a collective ecstasy would seize upon the crowd as it sang and danced, every movement and attitude obeying the law of ritual. At the foot of the pyramids, whose heads rose into the darkness, there, in the communion of the song and rhythmic movement to the beat of gongs, the crowd found release for the passions of its violent soul, and this without overstepping the boundaries of social duty. This self-controlled civilization, which imposed such a continual discipline upon all, and particularly upon its upper classes, had the wisdom to provide a permitted relaxation under the eyes of the gods for the repressed forces. Poems and music, rhythm and dance hour after hour in the red glare of the torches in the great square of the holy city. This was the liberation that the system offered for a while to the impassive men of whom it asked so much. Such as they were, with their greatness and their weaknesses, their ideal of order and their cruelty, their obsession with the mystery of blood and death, their sensitivity to the beauty of flowers, birds, and gems, their strength of religious feeling, strong to the point of suicide, their excellent practical organization of the state, their attachment to their land and their maize, which still did not keep their eyes from turning continually to the stars. With all this, these ancient Mexicans were civilized men. Their culture, so suddenly destroyed, is one of those that humanity can be proud of having created. In the hearts and minds of those who believe that our common inheritance is made up of all the values that our species has conceived in all times and all places, it must take its place among our precious treasures, precious because they are so rare. At long intervals, in the immensity of the world's life and in the midst of its vast indifference, men joined together in a community bring something into existence that is greater than themselves, a civilization. These are the creators of cultures, and the Indians of Anahuac, at the foot of their volcanoes on the shores of their lake, may be counted among them. This concludes Chapter 7 and this book.